so many civilians, which has led to cases of violence against women, rape, which has led to displacements, which has led to genocides, and human rights crimes against humanity. So when we look at all these things today, we realize that the role of the African Court of Justice is to make sure that these rights are being protected, and that we shouldn't have an environment that is being in a way cautioned by hostility, but that we should have a more peaceful and united environment that will have our rights being protected, and that will actually lead to and foster development in Africa. Because if we don't have those rights, those basic rights being provided according to Maslow's definition of our basic needs and the rights, then we realize that we'll not be able to be fulfilled enough to be able to participate in the governance of our different African countries.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asong Michael. Back to you, Dr. Stanley FONGOD. You listened to your co-panelist, but he evoked a question of the judiciary on the African continent, the need for the judiciary to be independent per se. Now, as a Pan-Africanist, do you think that the judicial system on the African continent is one that we could term as independent, contrary to what Pierre Lumumba stated, that Africa's judicial system is not independent, but is one that is being interfered, it has interference from outside actors?
Yes, of course. I think that if we were ever going to fully understand what is going on, we need to be able to look at the history of the ICC. If you look at the ICC, which is where the template for whatever is happening on the African continent is coming from, you will realize that the ICC, since its creation, has focused mainly on the African continent in terms of pursuit for whatever it called justice, and to pursue those who have committed war crimes. They have mainly focused on Africa. I think that the only country that has been to the ICC that's not on the continent of Africa will be Georgia. Apart from that, we have had Democratic Republic of Congo, we have had Sudan, we have had Kenya, we have had Ivory Coast. You're looking at Uganda, you name the rest, Central African Republic and its light. But the reality is we are actually also living in a society in the world that is not perfect. And if it was a perfect world, I don't think that we should even be talking about having any kind of an international court of justice on the African continent. I think that what the ICC should actually be able to step up and do things in the right direction, and that would save Africa and save the world as it is. Unfortunately, that's not the case, because if you look at countries like the United States, if you look at countries like China, if you look at countries like Russia, you know, they absolutely are not participating in the ICC. And I mean, of course, there are reasons for that, because these are countries that have committed war crimes in many parts of the world. And so you're talking about how independent the African continent is in terms of what the judiciary on the African continent is, in terms of having outside sources meddle in what is happening on the African continent. The truth is, yes, they are meddling on the African continent, and obviously they are not even participating in that which they so much hold to a higher standard, but yet they are meddling to whatever is happening on the African continent, because they also have to meddle with whatever is happening in individual countries where these crimes are taking place. If you look at the country like the DRC has many foreign entities that are operating in the DRC that are committing war crimes as we speak in the DRC. If you're going to basically prosecute those who are committing war crimes in the DRC, many U.S. corporations will absolutely be in trouble. Many individuals in the United States will be in trouble. Many individuals, you know, of Jewish descent will be in trouble in the DRC. Everyone in the DRC is committing some kind of atrocity or the other, but it's a banana republic free for all. So the truth of the matter is that you're talking about, you know, having any kind of independent judiciary when it comes to us on the African continent having some kind of an international court. It's like Patrice Lumumba said, it's not true. We have no independence at all, and I think that that's where we should start.
Thank you immensely. That is where Africa needs to start from. Now to you, Dr. Asong, you listen to your co-panelists, but then why do you think African nations are not ratifying this African court? Like, why is it yet to come into existence? He cited the International Criminal Court of Justice. Now, when you look at the African court, isn't it imperative for the African continent to have one rather than taking issues from Africa and taking it to the ICC?
Well, as a matter of fact, I will totally agree with my co-panelists on the fact that we don't have independence in Africa. And in one way or the other, we have some sort of extrinsic pressure upon us and control. Nevertheless, what he mentioned was some sort of extrinsic factor that actually hinders true independence in Africa. But nevertheless, I want to look at it from an intrinsic point of view. In Africa, what is the issue? What is our problem? And you are going to realize that the issue we are having in Africa is that most of our leaders have been violating the law.
Exactly.
Most of them have been violating the rule of law. It's true that in the ICC, most of the countries who have been there are African countries, and we have that impression that there is some sort of bias or injustice when it comes to Africa. But I think this is one of the reasons why the African Union decided to have its own court. Because, you know, when it concerns international courts, like we can cite the African court, that means courts which actually, yes, matters with, quote in quotes, some sort of violation of international principles or having an international element in the issue. Those courts are courts of last resort.
Exactly.
So nobody can seize, the ICC can't be seized directly. So you first have to go through domestic courts, then later on you seize the ICC. So there are usually jurisdictions of last resort. But now when we look at the African context and we realize that there has been this injustice, and you see that when these different issues are being resolved, you realize that in the ICC you have most of the time foreign judges who don't really understand the African context, you see. And those things are necessary because a judge is one who has to render a decision based on his conviction and also according to the law. But now, if you have a white judge, it becomes more difficult for him to actually be the right person qualified to resolve an African problem. And I think that's the reason why the African Union had to drive towards that. Even though, as I earlier on said, you can't build a continental governance system without having the three organs. So it's normally supposed to be something natural that when the African Union was being created, or when it started off with the Organization of African Unity, all these three bodies were supposed to have been established ab initio. So it's quite surprising that some of these courts were only established in 1998, and you see it doesn't make sense, whereas the African Union or the Organization of African Unity has been existing for decades. So when you look at all of that, you realize that there is some sort of lack of political will to establish such a court. And we know how our African leaders have been. Most of them have been dictators. Most of them, as I earlier on said, have blatantly violated human rights principles. So you see that urge or that desire to join such a court or to be member of such a court, you see, will actually make most of them to be uncomfortable. Uncomfortable, why? Because they can be dragged or they can be pulled before those courts. So you see, considering the fact that they are not sure of the way they have been managing their affairs and they know that they have violated so many human rights, they are then scared of the powers of this court. And that is the reason why, if you look at the protocol that actually establishes this court, you're going to realize that there are certain strings which are being attached. For example, they are going to tell you in Article 34, sub 6, they will tell you that the country that ratified that protocol and that actually accepted to be a member of the court has to make a declaration to permit individuals and non-governmental organizations to be able to seize that court. But that does not make sense. You see, so it means that these states are actually limiting the local standing of certain individuals who might have interest to be able to seize that court, which does not make things fair. So when you look at all of this, you realize that most of the African states are reluctant to join because they know that if we want to go into the closets, we are going to realize that most of them have been violating this, the African Charter or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the Rome Statute, which actually condemns international crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against aggression. So when you look at all of these things, then you understand why most African countries are adamant to joining the African Court of Justice. And for me, I think this is where we see the weakness of the African Union, because we simply realize that the African Union is extremely weak, because this is something which is supposed to be imposed to every African country, and that the court should have its own independence to be able to set the required rules and regulations of the court on how it can be seized, on which matters does it have competence, and how can it initiate procedures before it. But at the end of the day, we realize that the executive and the legislative of the African Union have permitted or have put a lot of strings attached, which does not permit this particular court to have its full independence. And we know that if a judicial organ doesn't have its independence, then it becomes difficult. It means that the decisions of that court will be influenced by those who have more power, and that is the executive and the legislative. So unfortunately, that is the context in which we find ourselves. So that's the first thing. Now, the second thing is that in Africa today, we have two legal systems, or let's say, in quotes, three legal systems. So we have the common law, we have the civil law, droit civil, and we have the Muslim law. So the Muslim law is more practiced in the northern regions of Africa. You have the common law, which is more practiced in former British colonies, and you have the droit civil law, which is being practiced in former French colonies. So this poses another issue, because now this court, which legal system
does it practice?
Will it practice? So it becomes now an issue, because procedures, civil law procedures are different from common law procedures, which are certainly different from Muslim law procedures. And the judges in those different legal systems don't actually behave in the same manner. For example, in the common law, the judge is more of an umpire, he just observes. Civil law, the judge can be active. He can decide to get into the matter, to get more facts, so that justice can be rendered. So Muslim law, they'll have to apply more of the Quran. So you see, when you put all of these things together, you realize that, okay, the judges who are being appointed or who are being voted, I don't know the manner in which they are being appointed, in quotes, how do they proceed when a matter is brought in front of them? So we realize that because we don't have a harmonized legal system, this will pose a problem. Even though when we look at our different international courts, whether it be the ICC or the International Court of Justice, they all practice the common law. But not all countries are common law. So it begins to have some sort of discrimination.
So is there no form of a unified system, like you mentioned, that brings together all these three forms of...
Unfortunately, no. Unfortunately, no. It's true, like what we have in Rwanda, they're trying to create a hybrid system where there's a mixture of both. In Cameroon, too, we have something like that, especially when you look at criminal procedures. When you look at the manner in which the court is being moved in criminal affairs, you realize that the interrogatory part of it, pleadings where you have examination in chief, cross-examination and re-examination are purely common law systems that are being implemented even in our civil law jurisdictions here in Cameroon. So there's some sort of hybrid legal system. But in the African Court of Justice, it's not the case. And that is the reason why Benin, I think in 2016, gave that declaration to permit individuals to and other NGOs to be able to seize the court. But later on in 2019, they had to withdraw. They had to withdraw it. So, and the reasons they gave was that they realized that there were some sort of violations, not respecting one or two rules and procedures, all those type of things of the court. So, of course, if this court does not have a harmonized legal system, then it will obviously shy certain states away from it. Because just imagine our West African states, which are purely civil law, and you have to seize now, the court is being seized, and you have to apply purely common law. It becomes then difficult for example, a lawyer who is in Senegal to be able to plead before that court. It will be more complicated because he's not used to that type of procedure. So I think what needs to be done is that the court has to review. I think the African Union will have to review certain matters like these issues which I have raised, and from there they will be able to bring more countries to join the court and have more members.
Exactly. Dr. Stanley Fongodd, you listened to your co-panelist. He stated that there is a need for a hybrid, or better still, harmonized legal system on the African continent that is going to permit say quite effectiveness of the African Court of Justice. Now, given the ongoing crisis we've seen on the African continent, say amidst the push for Africa to have an independent judicial system and foster for development. Now, listening to your co-panelists as an expert, how would you say, how important is it for the African continent to have an African court, especially in terms of, especially when the continent wants to have what they call independent justice?
I think that my co-panelist has listed, a series of things that needs to happen for us to have this independent system. And I think that, it's I've listened carefully to the things he said. And obviously, us having, almost 3 different systems on the African continent might be, tremendously difficult to have some kind of a harmony so far as, our judicial systems are concerned. But then that being said, I think that if you look at a country like South Africa in I think Botswana, those 2 countries have actually a hybrid system that is actually in effect today. I think that's the common law and the civil law, some elements of the civil law is actually being practiced in those countries. So I'm also thinking that when you start talking about trying to be able to persecute people who have outrightly participated, in some form of war crimes, I think we do so because those crimes were committed in specific countries. One of the things I'm thinking is this, that while we are struggling to be able to talk about having a judicial system on the African continent that is actually free and fair and have the capacity to be able to hear cases from different parts of the continent, why don't we focus on, like, say, the ECOWAS? Why don't we focus on, let's say, say, the Eastern Bloc, and have countries that have almost similar judicial systems to be able to have, sub-courts where people who have committed war crimes in those nations, can be able to be held accountable within the framework of the legal systems that they have, and just having, other people within that same bloc to be able to participate. I'm thinking that we have to be able to push this thing through, because there's no need for us to sit over and basically look at some of the issues we're having without pushing forward to make sure that we have a system that is quite free, a system that is, that is free from influence from outside of the continent, and also have a system that allows for lawyers to be able to hear cases, in countries, and also defend those who need to be defended in countries that needs their services. I think that we really needs to be able to look into that. And I say this because obviously he is a law expert, and so I'm sure that, there might be situations, or there might be legal freeze, within the African continent. But that being said, I think that what we need to do is to be able to make sure, like, honestly, go maybe block by block, and find ways in which we can be able to find a common ground within each block, and then have an overall consensus as to what part of which particular law system we will need on the African continent.
Dr. Stanley Fongod, sorry to cut you short, but then there do exist different criminal courts on the African continent at the regional level. We saw the Lutheran church massacre in Liberia, for instance, that was taken into account by the ECOWAS Court of Justice. So this is the only problem we have now, is how harmonious will all those blocks be to ensure that we have a solid, or say more effective, African Court of Justice.
When we start looking at, for example, the ECOWAS, you have both English and French countries that are part of the ECOWAS. The idea is actually that even within the ECOWAS itself, we need to start having, we need to look at the Western Bloc through the lens of individual countries, and then group those countries together based upon the laws they practice, and then do so in the East, do so in the South. And then if we can find some kind of harmony within the Western Bloc, like say the ECOWAS, and we can find harmony within the Eastern Bloc, then that becomes a good template for all of us to be able to focus on the African continent in such a way that we can have a structure on the continent that is unique.
African Court of Justice portray a positive image of the judicial system on the African continent, especially if we are looking at the consideration of the existence per se of the ICC.
We have the ICC, for example, and I think the ICC has about, if I'm not joking, maybe if I'm not mistaken, and all the cases they have heard. And you actually have a judge actually from the United States. Meanwhile, the United States itself is not even part of the ICC. So you're talking about billions of US dollars are being paid out to that causes ovarian cancer. Now, they are actually paying, I think maybe about 12-point-something billion US dollars is being paid out by Johnson & Johnson. And what is funny about that is this, that Johnson & Johnson have stopped distributing that particular product in the United States of America, but it has not done so on the African continent. So what this is, while we are focused on trying to be able to prosecute those who have committed war crimes on the African continent, which is noble, which is good, which I appreciate, but no one is absolutely bringing this particular companies, to be able to face justice on the African continent. Why they are paying the Americans tremendous amount of money for their pain and suffering, and for families of those who have died as a result of, these products that they have produced, like the powder by Johnson & Johnson. Who is holding them responsible on the African continent? Because the African is not participating in any of these payouts, but yet they continue to market these products on the African continent with absolutely no recourse. And that is where I stand. If we are not able to have a system on the African continent that protect the African, from this atrocious, behavior from companies that are situated in the West. If the West will do nothing about it, the Africans should.
Africans, indeed, it's time for you to take action. And everything boils down to political will, like you said, Dr. Asong, of course. Now, with this lack of political will among African leaders to say fully establish the African Court of Justice. Now, given the African Court of Justice, like you mentioned earlier on in your preamble, is supposed to be a body that's established by the African Union, or originally the Organization of African Unity. Now, what is the role of the African Union, and how can it be much more, much more established? And of course, how does that link to can we align that to the sovereignty of African nations? Are they scared it's going to violate their sovereignties, or there is more added to it?
Well, the African Union is simply an entity, a continental entity that has fostered durable development for Africa, that's setting Africans free from every bondage, have their own independence, autonomy, and to be able to look forward in building a better and greater Africa for future generations. Now, when we look at the African Union in itself has these different organs that will actually permit it to actually achieve these main goals. And that is the reason why, as I earlier on said, these bodies work together and they all have as role to control the others and make sure that the different principles which have been laid down to achieve the main goal of the African Union are being actually established. And that is why the African Court is indispensable for us to achieve that goal, because you know everything boils down to human rights, and it boils down to the UN Charter of states having their true independence, true autonomy, true sovereignty, of humans being able to access their fundamental rights. And you see, this court in itself has this primary role to protect human rights. And it's rather unfortunate for us today that we are realizing that even from the very start, the African Union took a lot of time to establish this court. So we actually ask ourselves, but how does this union function?
Could that be one of the limitations of the African Union? For
sure. And that's why I earlier on said that the African Union doesn't have the powers which it claims. Is almost like a toothless bulldog. And that's the issue we are having today, because the African Union has not been able to impose its power upon the member states. And I think that that's what would have been the main action of the African Union, that is to be able to bring all African states
together. It
could
be at the level of protocols.
Well, the protocols usually are being established by the state, by the member states during the during the assembly, the General Assembly. So it's those states that come together and decide on the protocols. If they'll adopt it or they'll not adopt it, or if there's an article that a state is not quite comfortable with it, they are going to strike it off and all the like. So ab initio, it starts
fundamental problem starts back at home.
Exactly. The type of collaboration we have amongst our African states. You know, most African states today are joining the African Union just for complaisance, like they just want to join and to be part of it.
What
but they don't really
understand. Will say to take pictures.
Yes, but they don't really understand the reason why they are into it. And that's why you see projects like the All African Passport not being able to be realized up to date. And that is because I think our presidents and member states have not yet understood the significance and the importance of being in the African Union. And I think it starts from there. When our member states, when our presidents will be able to understand the reason why the African Union exists, it is from there that will be able to put in place mechanisms, put in place bodies that will actually be respected and that will have full powers. It's worth noting that the African Union in itself are the member states. So if the member states are divided among themselves, if the member states decide to choose, okay, no, we are going to relate more or collaborate more when it concerns economic development or when it concerns military issues, but when it concerns violation of human rights, no, we are not into it. So you see that there is a fundamental problem from the start, and that's where the African Union will have to work a lot on. They will have to work a lot on sensitizing our different African states and member states to bring them to the understanding that the African Union is all about solidarity. It's about seeing ourselves as one Africans, and to be able to understand that we need to have the same vision and the same mission, even though we are in our respective African states. And if we are able to establish that, then you will realize that we will not have issues where there is a particular protocol where all the 55 African member states are members or have ratified it. Then you suddenly get to another one where you just have 34, like in the case of the African Court of Justice. So it's a very, very complex situation, and it will always go back to the fundamental problem, is that we Africans have not understood the importance of the union. And as long as we have not understood the importance of the union, we shall always be having issues like this. And this is not the first case we are having this type of issues. We have had the same thing with the all African passports. We have had issues with interconnecting Africa.
I mean, the Pan-African payment system. All those things are part of, part of the African Union that have yet to be established.
So it's rather an unfortunate situation, but we Africans don't really see ourselves as brothers and sisters, and we don't see ourselves as one. But I think that that has not been put in place because we are not. We are actually, but we just have this extrinsic influence and powers, probably from colonization and all the like, that has actually divided us. And I think that if the younger generation comes up today with a different type of mentality, trying to remind our brother states and sister states that we are one and that we can work together, we can break the barriers of boundaries that were being actually imposed on us because somebody sat in his room somewhere in Germany, I don't know, in Europe, and through our different African countries. So it's rather very unfair. So I think we have to rewrite the history of our continent. And to do that, I think the first thing is that we must break those barriers. I don't think that we should be living in a continent today that was actually designed by foreigners. I think it's really unfair, and it is really degrading to our own personality as Africans. So I think we need to stand up, look at things once more, and I think that one of the way out is that we should form a country in this continent. If we are able to do that, then I'm certain that we'll be able to resolve all the different humanitarian issues that we are facing in the continent. We'll be able to kick away poverty. We'll be able to put in place mechanisms that will actually permit us to foster our own growth and development.
Exactly, and of course an African politician once said that he who wins is the one who writes the story. So Africa, there is this need for us to rewrite the story. That's why we have programs like this to educate the African populace. Now, if the West sees the African continent, Dr. Stanley, as one country, there is this need for Africa to see itself like one people if they need to, get to that point where they can be able to, attain growth and development. Now, let me take you back. Let's recall the Liberian Lutheran Church massacre that took place in that part of West Africa. We're up to date at the ECOWAS Court of Justice. The case of those Christians or people that were fleeing the civil wars in Liberia is yet to be judged. They're yet to have justice for what happened to them. with that case, could that be some of the limitations of the judicial systems that do exist on the African continent?
Absolutely. And I think that,
Please,
I'll
can you unmute
piggyback a
your
little
mic,
bit on
please?
what my co-panelists said and try to be able to state it clearly that it will be extremely quite difficult for us to think about maintaining any kind of control on the African continent when it comes to the judicial system, not because of influence from the outside world, but because, frankly speaking, these systems really do not mean much. And this goes also as to whatever it is that an African Union will be doing. Reasons being that if you look at successful countries like the United States of America with its own judicial system, when they say anything, everybody else has to basically obey what the court says, and you can only be able to go to the Supreme Court to be able, to change things or actually hear cases at the level of the Supreme Court when every single thing has failed for you at the lower court. And the reason for that is because that is a structure that is highly respected. Those in the executive branch can absolutely do nothing so far as the court is concerned, and those in the executive branch can do nothing as well. And the reason is because when you have the executive and the legislative, when you have these two branches, they can be able to collude to be able to force, we have seen this in other African countries, to be able to force the court and force the court's hand to be able to do things that the court will not want to do. What that means is this: the arbitrary or the arbiter, the person who basically stands as a referee to be able to make sure that there is no something happening anywhere, it's actually the military. Once we do not have anyone on the continent that has a capacity to be able to enforce, you see, the court can say one thing, but somebody else has to lock up whoever the court wants to be locked up. Somebody has to pass out the judgment to whoever it is, to carry out the judgment to whoever it is that the court needs judgment to be carried out on. Once we do not have a unified front so far as our military is concerned, it will be extremely quite difficult. And that's why we can talk about all the protocols we want. It doesn't mean anything. If you have some criminal hiding in some African country, all right, who has been charged with some war crimes, and we need that particular person on the African continent, as long as whoever it is beneficial to whoever, is in power in that country, there's really nothing you can do. Otherwise, you want a full-scale, blown-out war to be able to bring that person out of that country and to face justice. Nobody wants to do that. But if you have a system on the African continent where there is this super military, I don't know exactly how that should be created, how we can do that, apart from the fact that we need to dissolve our international boundaries, these pseudo-international boundaries we have on the African continent, and have a united front in Africa. Well, the military on the African continent is one. If we are able to do that, then there will be no hiding place for folks who have committed war crimes on the African continent. You can't run anywhere, because the truth of the matter is, wherever you go, you'll be picked up and locked up. We don't care where you locked you up, because there is one system, and that system covers the continent. I think that in the case where we are talking about a united front, that united front, in my opinion, can only be feasible, can absolutely hold sway when we have, a country, not these, individual nation states that we have on the continent of Africa, struggling to do things by themselves, can't get a lot done. If we are a united front on the African continent, then we should be thinking about a judicial system that makes sense. And then obviously all the branches of government that we have on the continent will be fully respected, because there will be a military structure on the African continent that cannot be messed with. That's what makes America successful in more ways, and you can see with the 50 states we have in the US, those individual 50 states fully understand what the rule of law is, and whatever happens with the court, all right, they have to fully respect. The governors of the different states have to fully respect whatever happens, so far as the courts are concerned. And the courts are actually one, even though a court might be in another state, but it's still the same court, it's still the federal court. And so they have basically courts that are for the states, but you have a federal court that basically is for the United States. And I think that those kind of systems should be what we have on the African continent. In that case, whatever actually happens to any individual at the level of the federal court might be a federal court for Africa. That will be what it is that goes across the continent in such a way that wherever you go, if you have committed a crime, you'll be held accountable and you have to basically answer for it.
Exactly, and that boils us back to the lack of political will on the part of African leaders. But then let's focus on something else, Dr. Asong, and I'll take you back to what happened in Burkina Faso in 1998 with the murder of a journalist, NABESEH, in that part of the African continent, where he was killed alongside 3 of his companions. But then there wasn't justice until the African court back in the days in 2014 had to intervene and urge the Burkinabe government to further investigation and, of course, pay for reparations to the families of these victims. When we're getting down the memory lane, for instance, if the African courts was so powerful, was able to take action back then in 2015, what happened over time that up to date we're still talking about how effective, or say we're still talking about the proper establishment of the African court, and why did it suddenly get back into the shadows?
Well, I think it's the same thing we've been saying from the start. There's lack of political will. And, you know, when the incident took place in Burkina Faso, I think it was blatant, it was flagrant, and everybody could see that, okay, no, there was some sort of violation. And, of course, you know, these courts operate in a particular manner. You see, they always tell you that is when it has gotten to its worst that the fire appears in court.
Yeah, the last resort.
The last resort. Then you begin to ask yourself that, okay, so we need to wait for the war to start and to kill maybe 1,000, 2,000 or 5,000 people before they consider it as something with enough weight and grievous enough or severe enough to be able to be brought before that particular jurisdiction or court. So when you look at all these things, you realize that there are so many other violations that will not find themselves before that court. You see, not because they are not violations of human rights, but just because they don't yet have that that thing in it which makes them look very, very severe in such a way that they should be brought before that court. So when you look at what happened in Burkina Faso, I think it was quite alarming, and not only alarming in the sense of the act, but also alarming in the sense that the civil society had to stand up to say no unto it. So you see that the court has another way of being moved to actually do or to actually exercise its powers. So it will also need the participation of the people and the civil society. So if we take, for example, like the issues we are having in the Anglophone crisis in the Northwest and the Southwest regions. So if everybody is calm in Cameroon, for example, that's what is happening now. Everybody seems calm, even those in the Southwest or the Northwest. When each time there are violations of human rights, everybody just sits quiet. Then you realize that the ICC, even though we are not a member of the ICC, but we could still be brought before the ICC through an extraordinary procedure of the Security Council. But you realize that the ICC will just be dormant about it, because for us Cameroonians, it doesn't seem to be like a real issue. Not everybody sees it to be a real issue. But I bet you, if all Cameroonians stand up today, the civil society stands up today and say that no, this thing will have to end. We are going on the streets, we are going to protest. Don't be surprised, next month you will see Cameroon being advised to come up and explain what is happening, or government officials to come up to the ICC and explain what is happening. If not, they are going to initiate a procedure or impose on them that they should resolve the problem as quick as possible. So you see that those are the issues that actually would prevent this court from acting. So it might be the last time they acted was 2016, and right up to now, nothing really, because at the end of the day, you need the actors you need the member states, because to seize this court, it can either be seized by the Commission on Human Rights, it can either be seized by a member state, it can either be seized by intergovernmental organizations. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of manipulation, whether it be from the member states who are committing those crimes, those violations, whether it be by intergovernmental organizations who are, in quotes, accomplice to the member states, and the Commission itself of Human Rights, which is very, very weak, and in one way or the other is not able to come out boldly and say that, okay, there are this and this violations. So when you look at all of that, it boils down to what we have been saying, lack of political will. It boils down to the fact that this particular court does not have full independence and does not have full judicial power over the violation of human rights in Africa. And finally, certainly due to the fact that certain cases might not be able, or decisions might not be able to be enforced due to the fact that not all states are members, and we don't have that executory mechanism that will permit us to be able to enforce these decisions. So those are all the things that can hinder this court from actually carrying out its duties adequately.
Exactly. Now, Dr. Stanley FONGOD, you listened to your co-panelist earlier on. He mentioned that the African Union is not as engaged as it should be because the arms, one of the arms, like the African Court of Justice, is yet to get into full movement. Now, with all this information, with all this in mind, now with the current crisis that the African continent is facing at the moment in this contemporary society, do you think there is a need for the African Union?
Yes, there is a need for the African Union. I think that, our journey towards a more united Africa might be through the window of the African Union. But the problem with the African Union, in my opinion, is that we need to be able to revamp the African Union, which means that we can either do one or two things. We can dissolve the African Union and start afresh, or we can be able to make sure that those we elect to the African Union, which are obviously our head of state, are folks who we have selected who have a Pan-African view in mind. As long as you keep electing those who are manipulated and controlled by foreign powers and entities, dictators who have been in power for 50, 60, 70 years, all of their lifetime they have been in authority, they have been in power. As long as you keep electing these people, and these are the people who are controlled and manipulated by the West, by the EU member states, as long as these men are in power, the reality is that Africa will always be subjected to God knows what, and we will never be able to carry out anything successfully on the African continent for the interest of the African if the interest of the Western world and Europe is not in place. So we have to be able to make sure that we elect those who we know are Pan-Africans, men and women who have Africa at heart, all right, to be able to be members of the Organization for African Unity. If we do not do that, it will be extremely quite difficult for us to be able to enact anything. So whatever those boys try to do, it's the same cartel. They are the same men. They eat in the same restaurants. They dine together at the same table. They do things, among themselves. So whatever the rest of Africa is facing is not what they are facing. They live a completely different lifestyle. Their kids are not in Africa, all right? Their kids do not participate in the same educational system like your own children. They don't go to the same hospitals like you. Unfortunately, they live in this utopia that they have created for themselves that is absolutely distant to the regular African. And so if that was going to be the case, then that organization means absolutely nothing, because it will never be able to cater for the needs of the African. If you really want to cater for the need of the African, you need to start electing men and women who understand the African struggle, people from individual countries who understand the pain of the African. I'm talking about individuals who have absolutely gone through what it takes to survive in Africa, having nothing, pushing from the bottom up. Those are the individuals individuals you need to be able to bring so that we can be able to form a union, a more powerful union that structure, Africa to move us forward to be able to compete, on the world stage. But as long as these same old dinosaurs are in place, there's really not much we can do about it. And unfortunately, it looks like these men will continue to do what they want to do, because I hardly see anything changing if individual countries on the African continent do not wake up and say enough is enough. We are tired of the status quo. We need something to change. If that change is not driven from within, I'm not sure that any other change from without will make any sense. So we have to be able to make sure that individual nations, young men, young women in these nations, basically rise up and say, you know what, we are looking for a different future. We hope for a brighter future. But the truth of the matter is, if you're going to look at what's happened over the last 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades, there's no way in which you can, there's a definition for insanity which says as long as you keep doing the same thing over and over again, the same way, the same pattern, the same structures, and you're expecting a change, then, the logical conclusion is that something is wrong with your brain. So you're mad, you're insane. That being said, we need to be able to change something. If an equation, if you have an equation, a mathematical equation, and you keep having the same answer, that simply means your inputs are the same. You have to change something. And I think that time has come for us to basically change the structure and the type of leadership we have on the African continent if we are going to be able to enjoy any kind of unity that makes sense, if we are going to be able to enjoy, a structure on the continent that cares for the African and actually have the Africans, desires and the African ambitions in mind. If that was not going to be the case, I think we have dark days ahead. If not, let's do something about it. Let's change the way things are on the African continent, especially with our elections.
There is a need for change on the African continent. Just to reiterate that even come 2025, the African Union Commission shall have a new chairperson, one that will be tasked with leading the aspirations of the African people. Hopefully, things get to change at that part. But then, when we're looking at the African continents, an expert once said that with the recent ratification of Angola of the Statute of the Malabo Protocol, the need for an African Continental Criminal Court could no longer wait on the African continent. Listening to what your co-panelists said, and of course the need for this court to be on the African continent, one that is going to reflect the vision and aspirations of the African people, one that is going to lead the African people through justice. With all this in mind, do you think that the African continent, or say change in Africa, it's one too that can no longer wait? And how soon can that be for the African people?
I think today most Africans have the general view that things need to change.
Yeah,
I think since independence of most of our African states, which has been over, I think, 60 years now, we have realized that we are almost still standstill. And development-wise, we are really backwards.
With some other schools of thought to say some African countries were really not independent.
Of course, we can't really talk of true independence. It's some sort of independence with strings attached, and in quotes, most African countries today are not independent. So when we look at that, we simply realize that if we have to do things correctly, if we have to be able to prosper development today in Africa, then it is indispensable for us to have true independence. And the only way we can grab this independence is if we decide to change our mindsets. That if we decide to see ourselves as one, if we decide to collaborate and cooperate more amongst ourselves. So we will simply realize that all of these things are far-fetched because we Africans have not changed our mentality. But today, I think there is a growing population, and particularly young Africans, who are beginning to understand by seeing the way things function in other places, like in China, in Asia, in Europe, and even in America or South America, that most of these countries or these different continents are working hand in hand because they have understood that at the end of the day, for them to succeed and for them to excel, they need to share their knowledge, they need to cooperate among themselves, and each and everyone chips in what he has. But unfortunately in Africa, not only has there been, we are isolated, and there has been those extrinsic factors which has led to our division, and more to that, interiorly we are not that united. But today I think things are changing. The younger generation is beginning to take their responsibilities at hand, and there is that growing awakening amongst Africans towards Pan-Africanism, towards their true independence, sovereignty, and autonomy. And Africans today are beginning to understand that they have to work together. I think there are so many conferences being organized by the African Union in Africa, and that has helped to foster more collaboration and cooperation amongst African states and amongst Africans themselves, because I think it's not only about the states, but it's about Africans. So if Africans are able to recognize the fact that they are one and that they have to work together in developing their continent, then it will be easier at the level of the state, because at the end of the day, in every constitution in Africa, they'll always tell you sovereignty belongs to the people. So it's all about the people first of all. If the people can see themselves as one, then automatically the states will be able to merge and become one, and we'll have that African state which we desire, that will actually help us go move towards our sustainable development. But that will not be an easy thing to do, and that's why those who are more illuminated in their way of thinking, in their way of doing things, will have to present the type of Africa that we all desire and we all hope for, and trying to convince the others through advocacy so that they will be able to see the benefits we shall have in being one and working together. And if we are able to do that, whether it be at the regional levels and progressively we form one African bloc, then certainly we'll be able to conquer the whole world, because we have everything necessary, whether it be the natural resources, whether it be the suitable environment to be able to work efficiently, and every other thing that is being required for development. So we just need to work towards that. We need to change our mindsets. We need to see ourselves as one, and certainly things will be better.
Things will get better indeed. Now, just in line with what you said, Dr. ASONG, I'd like to challenge this next question to you, Dr. FONGOD. Now, he said unity is strength, and Africans need to identify themselves as one people for them to be able to move towards this sustainable development which the African continent aspires for. Now, Dr. FONGOD, how important is unity in the full implementation of the African Court of Justice?
I think that the African Court of Justice will only, be able to have any kind of forward motion. It will be when the continent fully becomes integrated. And I think that we might actually start that by talking about some unity. But then when we talk about unity, what do we really mean? How do you address the issues of unity when we still have issues that we need to be able to address when it comes to actually implementing whatever it is that we're trying to do? So we can talk about unity all we want, but then we have to go past to the level where there is clear-cut, vision for implementing things that we basically set forth as part of, our forward progression, as part of our forward movement, as we try to become competitive in the 21st century, especially, looking at us and the rest of the world. So the reality is that, yes, I am in for unity, but we need to clearly define these terms, and we cannot just keep talking about unity every single day and then nothing is happening. So maybe we talk about unity in addressing the issues of cross-border trade. Maybe we talk about unity in addressing the issues of basically tariffs for goods and services that is produced in different African parts of different African different parts of Africa, so that by the time different countries on the African continent are trying to be able to sell their goods and services in other African countries, there should be no tariffs. Maybe when we talk about the issues of actually having unity, maybe we should address that when it comes to visa. Why should another African be paying any other country on the African continent, visa fees just to visit those individual countries? That's crazy. No African should be allowed to pay any money to any African country, just because they're trying to have access to those countries. You should not do that. I think that we have come of age not to be able to allow ourselves, to be able to allow ourselves and limit Africans, from being able to become productive on the African continent just because we want to make a buck or two, on visa application fees. We need to be able to put an end to that. Maybe when we start talking about unity, we really have to be able to define our terms clearly. We have to be able to have a broad perspective of our vision so far as unity is concerned. And if that was going to be the case, that's the only time I see us literally, start talking about a forward progressive movement that will allow us as Africans to fully start maybe embracing the whole entire concept of a Pan-African front where every African, fully emerges to become, members of a unique country, not just Africans who live on the continent. We are Africans, and I think that time has come for us to address ourselves as Africans, not by our individual nations. First of all, when you leave Africa and you are in the West, you are in America, you are in Europe, no one treats you as a Rwandese, no one talks to you as a Cameroonian, you're treated as an African. When racism is being poured on us out here in the West, they don't do so because we come from Cameroon, they don't do so because we are Ghanaians, they do so because we are black, melanated people, we are Africans. And so we really need to be able to embrace this culture on the African continent, do away with international boundaries that were not placed there by us in the first place. I think that the first rule of emancipation for the African is to really deal away with international boundaries. If we can do so, that's the only day that the African is truly free. Apart from that, we are still, look, the international boundaries that we have on the African continent was designed by Europeans, and that is, there's nothing else more superior for the African than that. And so as long as we are talking about white supremacy and every single thing else, that particular structure stands to basically handicap the African from whatever gains we're supposed to make just by interacting with ourselves. If we can only interact with ourselves, then we can truly be able to start talking by and defending and defining at the same time, what we truly understand as the freedom that we're looking for as Africans. And I think that that's when, any kind of court of justice on the African continent will also begins to emerge. As long as we don't have these basic things in place, it will be very difficult for us to look at a major structure, a mega structure as an international court or an African, court of justice, to have the authority it needs to be able to fully function on the African continent when we are still dealing with, visa application fees and all kinds of stuff. That's to me, those are the basic things we need to start with.
Thank you, Dr. FONGOD. I'll stay with you before I conclude with you, Dr. ASONG. Now, given we're in a geopolitical world per se, now you mentioned that there are several aspects the African continent needs to address first and foremost before looking at the implementation or full implementation of the African Court of Justice. Now, in a geopolitical world in which the African continent finds itself at the moment, how does this Court of Justice, how does it come into play? Just in a few words, please.
Sorry, can you repeat that again? The last part, there's a huge noise coming in from the system. Can you repeat that again, please?
Yes, so I was saying this, given we're in the geopolitical world, the African continent finds itself amidst geopolitical tendencies at the moment. How would such a court, an African Court of Justice, come into play? Just in a few words.
Well, yeah, well, I really didn't get that. Let me do the best I can. I think that if we start talking about being able to establish any kind of court on the African continent that makes sense, then we really need to be able to integrate every part of the continent. And I think I pick it back again to what my co-panelist said. We have to make sure that we fully understand the different systems we have on the African continent, create some kind of a harmony across these systems. And if that was going to be the case, we must do it block by block. I'm hoping that the block by block approach would work so that we fully can be be able to start having a general conversation as to a court that is fully for the entire region, for the entire continent. But let's go block by block first and then understand what works at those levels, and then we can fully be able to integrate things, at a more broader perspective.
Thank you so much for that brilliant and insightful, as well as timeful contribution. And now to conclude with you, Dr. ASONG, now, we've cited the importance of an African Court of Justice for the African people, but as a barrister and as a Pan-Africanist, as an African man, to conclude this conversation, what's the way forward for the African people?
Well, the way forward is us Africans to renew our mindsets, to be able to see ourselves as one, because I think everything starts from there. You can't create a whole system and impose on people to join, whereas the foundation of that system has to be based on the fact that these people are first of all united. So I think everything has to do with mentality and mindset. So we need to change our mentality. We need to see ourselves as one. If there is an African Court of Justice, if it is called African Court of Justice, then it means it is for Africans. So not ratifying this particular protocol, establishing this court, just shows that we are not united. And the issue is fundamental. We don't see ourselves as one. We don't see ourselves as a nation. We don't see ourselves as one people. And it will have to start from there. And moreover, all Africans will have to stand by the rule of law, because that is one of the issues hindering some states to actually be members of the African Court of Justice. So we have to stand by the rule of law, make sure that we elect leaders who actually respect the rule of law, and that will not shy away from this protocol establishing the African Court of Justice. If we are able to do that, then certainly we'll be able to create that atmosphere that will be able to put in place all the different organs that will work interactively, will be able to control each other, and that will actually secure the protection of human rights in Africa, and that will certainly prosper development and durable development for all African states and Africa as a whole.
Thank you so much, Dr. ASONG, for your contribution on today's edition of the program.
Thanks.
I will acknowledge the participation and presence of Dr. Stanley FONGOD for your contribution as well on today's edition of Talking Point.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's on that note that we draw down the curtains of today's edition of Talking Point over your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And of course, do stay in company of our numerous transmissions.